just standing up here. I haven't been up here for a long time up on stage. So just watching you guys praise the Lord is such a blessing to me. And I think of a story that I read on Facebook. I think I shared it, I don't know, with someone. But anyways, it was talking about a guy. He became a multi-billionaire. And, you know, in today's society, that's successful. He created an empire, and he died in his 50s. He got pancreatic cancer. And his last words were pretty simple. He could hire anybody to do anything for him. He could hire someone to drive his car, clean his house, mow his grass, do whatever, but he couldn't hire anybody to take cancer, to give him life. And it made me start thinking about Christ. You know, there's no charge, right? It was paid. He paid the ultimate. And I think of that because, you know, this world, it's our society and our children, they see so much of everything now. Like, when I was a kid, we didn't have internet. We did, but it was dial-up. And when you sat there, it took like 45 minutes to get the page to load. And I remember when I was a youth pastor back at Smithfield, and whenever I had a dial-up to connect with another, get my email, it took that long, and you're sitting there, oh man, I'm going to go turn on the email, I'll go get something to eat, and I'll come back and it'll be ready. But I share that with you because, you know, we get up every day and something seems to be going wrong. You know, there's so much hate, but we can't give up. You know, God is in control. You know, we think of yesterday. I know Darlene said, what's going on with our world? We don't know what's going on, but we know that God's in control, and his word tells us that. And I share that because we as humans, we kind of get depressed sometimes, or we get discouraged. But don't get discouraged. We know who's in control and who's the author of life, and we know our fate. So just know that he's in control. I share that with you. Now I'm going to ask Greg to come up. Kids, when I walk off the stage, we're going to go down to WOW, but I'm going to welcome Greg up here. He's come a good ways for us, and I'm going to pray with you, and he's going to share with us this morning. So we're excited you're here, brother. Yeah. What'd you drive, 2 hours, 2.5? 2:15. So we're excited here. He's here, aren't we? So let me pray with you. God, I just lift up Greg to you this morning, and I just pray again that you would just use him in a mighty way, Lord. Use him as a vessel. That each person that's sitting here, Lord, that I pray that you would work in our hearts, Lord. Just penetrate and just set us on fire, God. As we're sitting here, I pray as he speaks, it would be your words, Lord, that you would just speak through him and speak to each one of us, God. Set us on fire and just use him in a mighty way. Fall upon us and him right now, God. We thank you and we love you. In your precious name, amen.
My goodness. It sure is a true blessing to be here. Pastor Bruce first came into knowing the Rice clan, my family, back in the day. One of his first positions that he had in the Friends was youth pastor at a church my father was serving at in Virginia. And we've been friends for years and years, and I love Bruce and Judy. Have had many opportunities to do ministry with them. Was on youth board for our denomination with Bruce for, I think 9 years. All 9 years that I was on, we were on together. Jonathan, his son, went on a couple missions trips with me. So it's just been a lifelong, for me, lifelong experience of friendship, and it's a true honor to be able to share in his church with you guys this morning. I tell you what, I feel like it doesn't matter what I do, if you guys have him every week, I don't know how I'm ever going to measure up. Bruce is such an amazing pastor, servant. He loves the Lord. JC, known him for many years as well, and it's good to get him out of his comfort zone every once in a while, but he loves the Lord and been involved with camps and lots of different things with JC as well. So it's an honor to be here this morning. I believe in speaking with Bruce this past week, he told me he normally preaches about an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes. So I put several sermons together to be able to get to that. So I'm just kidding. I won't go quite that long. I'm going to be sharing story this morning that's found in it's found in 2 Kings chapter 4, and it's going to finish in 2 Kings chapter 8. But if you'd like to follow along in your Bibles, I would encourage you to do that. If you don't know where 2 Kings is, let me help you out. It's right after 1 Kings. So I figured that might help out. It's actually the 12th book in the Bible. So if you go to Genesis and go 11 books over, you're at 2 Kings. So we're going to be at chapter 4. So the message that I'm going to share today is entitled, The Shunammite Does It Right. The Shunammite Does It Right. And then I subtitled it, Her Story is History. Or I could say her story is his story, because she truly has the heart of Christ throughout this story. So today we're going to be looking at the Shunammite. Now, there's probably one or two or maybe quite a few of us that don't know what or who a Shunammite is, and we have no clue if she's doing it right or not. But that's why we come to church, to learn about what the Bible has to teach us. And so the Shunammite is found in 2 Kings chapter 4. There's actually two Shunammite women in the Bible. The one we're going to talk about also, Abishag, who was the young maiden that took care of David at the very end of his life. Does anyone remember that story? He got old and he couldn't take care of himself, and they brought in a young maiden. It was Abishag, and many scholars believe she was actually related to the Shunammite woman we're going to talk about today. So if you'd like to join me, we're going to begin at verse 8. So 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse 8. It says, One day Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came, he stopped by there to eat. She said to her husband, I know the man who comes this way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us. One day Elisha came, and he went up to his room and lay there. He said to his servant Gehazi, Call the Shunammite. So he called her, and she stood before him. Elisha said to him, Tell her, you've gone to all this trouble for us. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak to the king on your behalf, or the commander of the army? She replied, I have a home among my people. Well, what can be done for her? Elisha asked. And Gehazi said, She has no son, and her husband is old. I find that very funny, actually. She doesn't say she's old and her husband is old. Anyway, sorry. Picking up verse 15, and Elisha said, Call her. So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. About this time next year, Elisha said, You will have a son in your arms. No, my lord, she objected. Please, man of God, don't mislead your servant. But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about the same time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. Now, let me give just a little bit of background here. I tell you what, I've had a few weeks off. I've been enjoying some time with my family, and so I've got all kinds of things I've been prayed for, I think 3 times today. Man, I am just charged up about this message, and I believe God has a word for each of us if we're willing to listen. But just a little bit of background on this passage in 2 Kings. Elisha is Israel's prophet. So he was the one that was trained by Elijah. You might remember Elijah was taken to heaven by a chariot of fire. And as he's going to heaven, this is what I always do when someone's phone goes off in church. I just start dancing with the dance. Okay, sorry. So Elisha's taken off into heaven, and as he's heading into heaven, his cloak falls off, and Elisha picks it up, and he takes that mantle, and he becomes the new prophet for Israel, the new major prophet. And so Elisha lives at this time in Mount Carmel. And Mount Carmel has a prophet school, and he's kind of the head teacher, the head leader at that prophet school at Mount Carmel. At the same time, in Samaria, you have the capital of Israel. Israel's divided into two kingdoms. The northern tribes of Israel, their capital city was Samaria. So Elisha would travel to speak to the king often, and he would go right through the town of Shunem. So that's why he's going through Shunem a lot. This woman, who's a very well-to-do woman, keeps seeing him. Excuse me. Keeps seeing him and invites him over for some lamb kebabs and some warm pita bread. Anyone else ever been to Israel? Your daughter's in Israel? I've had lamb kebabs in Israel. They're amazing. The pita bread is also really, really good. So she's offering him meals, and so she's looking to take care of him. She has a real heart for service. So the woman sees this man of God that's traveling through, so she starts cooking meals for him. He's stopping by regularly with his servant Gehazi. She's cooking him meals, but then she takes it to another level. She decides to add a whole nother story, and actually we're going to be talking about her story today, but she decides to add another story and asks her husband to build another room on the top of their roof. Now, that sounds really strange to build a room on the roof here, but there where you have flat roofs, you could support another structure up on top of there. So they built another room, and it was a great place to get away from the noise and the hustle and the bustle, and so they built a room. So she builds a room up on the roof. Get myself ahead. There we go. So she's talked with her husband. They agree to build this room together, and so she builds a room up on the roof, and as they're finishing the room up, she decides to make a quick trip to IKEA, which, by the way, IKEA was just being built when I served up at Alum Creek Friends for a while. It was just being built, but so she took a quick trip to IKEA. I think it's called something a little different in Israel, but and so she got a table and a chair. They got a bed. By the way, the bed was not a Tempur-Pedic. It was a mat that you would have laid on. It was a wooden chair and a table and a lamp, and put it all into this room. But we hear that, it's like, okay, it's kind of a simple room for today's standards. But at that time, that was quite a big deal. Room space was at a premium, and so when you built these houses, you were lucky to have enough room for the bedroll to fully lay out. So they made this room big enough that not only could it have a little place to rest, it could have a table and a chair. She thought about making sure that he had a lamp in there, so if God was speaking to his heart, he could do some studying or he could do some writing while he was there. Even at night, he could light the lamp and he could be able to see at night. And so it was a great place for Elisha to be able to get away and do some resting, working together. Okay, I'm going to do this. So my current location, they give me a wireless mic, and I walk around a lot. So I'll trip over my wire here in a little bit, most likely. So, excuse me. So the Shunammite woman was so attentive to all the needs that she saw. So Elisha wanted to be he's thankful and wanting to do something for her, invites her to come in to where he is staying and says, "What can I do for you? I would love to find some way that I could serve you for all this amazing stuff you're doing for me. You're being so kind." And so he says, "I'll tell you what, would you like me to go talk to the king or talk to the commander of the army for you?" Well, that's a pretty tall order to say, "I'll go talk to the king." However, he's an advisor to the king, so he really could do that. To say, "I'll go talk to the commander of the army," if you're having a major dispute with others in your community, the commander of the army sometimes would settle that. If you're having any other struggles or issues, or if you wanted any favors, you would want to talk to the king. So these are two pretty big offers. Elisha had been giving advice to the army because God had been telling him where their enemy, the enemy of Aram, where they were going to be. So he had a relationship with the commander of the army. He had a relationship with the king because he has given him advice as well. And so he offers to go speak to the king or the commander of the army, and the woman says, I have a home, a place amongst my people. It's good. I don't really need anything. So he says to Gehazi, he was also there, and says, what can I do for her? What does she really want? Well, the desire of any woman, particularly in this culture at this time, was to have a son, to have a child, because you carried on an heir to carry on your family. You carried on your legacy. And this woman had not been able to have a child yet. And as it says, her husband was getting old. And so, I would just love to have a son. So Elisha calls her in and says, a year from now, you will have a son. Now, I think it's interesting that if you look at the phrase that was said from Elisha, it's the exact same phrase, word for word, that was told to Abraham and Sarah. A year from now, you'll have a son. And so Elisha says that, and it's such an exciting revelation, a shocking revelation, and yet she doesn't want to be let down. She's been trying for her whole life to have conceive a son, have a son, and it hasn't happened. It hasn't worked yet, and so she doesn't really want to believe it. And so she says, "No, man, don't be messing. Are you for real? Come on, just don't get my hopes up." And so a year later, she does find out that she does find out that she's pregnant soon. A year later, she has a healthy son. God heard the desire of her heart and answered her request. Isn't it interesting how her serving God, her raising the roof, has a little bit of a different meaning today. Her serving was the way that God was able to help meet the deepest desire that she had. The prophet was able to pray over her and help her to be able to conceive with her husband a son. So that's the first part of the story, and that's a pretty amazing scene. I love scenes and stories. All of us, where we live, we're currently in a scene. But the scene that we were in is not the whole story. The scene is just one part of the story. And if you look at a time where you're just getting out of your education and you're going into your first house or your first job, the scene might look totally different than when you're finishing your career and things are different. When you're young and you don't have a lot of wisdom, but you have lots of energy, things look different. That's one scene. Then when you get older and you don't have the energy anymore, but you have a little bit more wisdom. Anybody with me on that? It's different scenes. Does that make one scene good, one scene bad? No, but they're different scenes. If you only look at one scene, you might get a totally incorrect picture of the whole story. So the first scene for this Shunammite woman is she was caring about the man of God. She takes care of him. She provides food. She provides a room and the things in the room that he would need. And then she gets the desire of her heart. But what we find out is that sometimes the dream has to die before the miracle comes. Sometimes the dream has to die before the miracle comes. Pick up with me, if you would, at verse 18. The child grew, and one day he went out with his father, who was with the reapers. He said to his father, "My head, my head." His father told a servant, "Carry him to his mother." Isn't that just like a father? I don't feel good. Go see your mom. I have 2 boys. I know all about that. That one's harder to dance to. Sorry. After the servant had lifted him up and carried him to his mother, the boy sat in her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and she shut the door and went out. So, wait a minute. this doesn't make sense at all. This scene is not at all enjoyable. This child that was the desire, the hope of the heart of this Shunammite woman, the promised gift that had been given by God, this child dies. That can't be right. I must have read that wrong. That can't be right. Historically, we know this child would have been someplace between 6 and 8 years of age. He goes out to the field to help his father. His father, a fairly wealthy farmer. How do we know he's fairly wealthy? He had several other reapers that were working for him. He went out with the reapers to reap in the field. So his son's out there with him and starts saying, my head, very likely. Looking at the region, the time frame, one of the problems that they had was heat stroke. Now, coming through some of the heat we just had not that long ago, we might be able to relate to that just a little bit. But there, it's so much hotter and arid, and so heat stroke was a common problem, and it was very dangerous for children, and could even be deadly for children. You have heat stroke. So this boy, one of the first symptoms of heat stroke is a splitting headache, and so this boy gets a headache, and he starts saying, my head, and the dad passes him off to mom. Mom holds on to him, and I'm sure is praying. She's sitting with him in his lap and praying over him. God, please help my son. Please help my son. And he dies. And I'm amazed because the Shunammite woman doesn't miss a beat. She doesn't miss a beat. She instantly takes her son, puts him up in the room of Elisha, shuts the door, and then leaves to go see Elisha. We're going to read that here in a second. But she instantly leaves him in that room upstairs, Elisha's room, and goes to get Elisha. Shuts the door off that way. No one or no thing, no animals or anything, or no other people are going to bother the son because he's behind a closed door. And she goes to get him. So pick up with me at verse 22. It says, she replied to her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return. Why go to him today? He asked. It's not the new moon or Sabbath. That's all right, she said. So the woman goes to her husband and says, I need a servant and a donkey. I'm going to go see Elisha. And the guy, being a typical guy, by that time had forgotten that his son wasn't feeling good. And he's like, what are you going to church for? Because she wants to go see Elisha. That's where they go to church. And he says, it's not Sabbath. It's not the new moon. The new moon was once a month. At the beginning of the month, they would have a special church service. So it'd be like us saying, it's not Christmas. It's not Easter. It's not Sunday. What do you want to go to church for? And she says, that's all right. Do you know what that's all right means in Hebrew? Guys, those of us who are married, we might want to hear this because it's important, because a lot of times when a woman says something, it means a whole lot more than what's said. You guys ever learn that? If you guys don't know that, that might be one of the best points of today. So she says, that's all right. In Hebrew, this same passage that she said is translated, please be quiet. Do not trouble me by asking questions, and let me do what I want. Man, somehow it loses something in translation, doesn't it? Please be, it's all right. Please, don't ask me a bunch of questions. Quit bugging me and just let me do what I need to do. And her husband is a wise man because he says, okay, go ahead. So she takes the donkey and the servant, and they head to Mount Carmel to meet Elisha. They see her coming from a distance. See, they're on Mount Carmel. What is the first part of that word? It's Carmel. What was the first part? Mount. They're on a mountain, so they could see her coming a long ways away. So when they see her coming a long ways away, Elisha says to Gehazi, go find out if she's okay. So Gehazi goes running down and says, are you okay? She says, I'm fine, but she keeps going. Then she goes up and grabs onto the feet of Elisha, because that's who she went to see. She's in great distress and despair. And she tells Elisha, and Gehazi that her son has died. Well, Elisha tells Gehazi to tuck his robe up into his belt and take off. Now, why do you do that? Because if you have a robe that goes to the ground, which men would have at that time, and you're trying to run someplace, you would trip over your robe. So you tuck it up so you can go faster. Tuck up your robe, take off, take my staff with you, and I want you to go. And if you pass anybody, don't you talk to them. And if anyone talks to you, don't respond. Just go straight there. You're in a hurry, boy. Get there now. So he takes off, but the woman won't leave unless Elisha comes with him. She came to get Elisha to come because Elisha was God's man. She had in her heart that she knew she needed to have God's prophet, God's man, come to where her son was at. And so he agrees and he comes, but Gehazi runs on ahead with the staff. He takes the staff, and it says that he lays the staff on the son's head or on his face. That doesn't mean he hit him with it. Doesn't mean he went up and poked him, but it was a way of seeing if he was in a deep sleep, if something else was going on. The staff also represented God's power. It was not a magical staff, but it was a representation of God's power through Elisha. And so he took that and he tried to pray over him. He tried to see if he could wake him up, and he ends up going back to Elisha and says, he's still asleep. He's still asleep. So Elisha made his way to the house. I'll pick up again in verse 32. When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy laying dead on the couch. He went in and shut the door on the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay on the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands, and he stretched himself out on him. The boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, and then he got on the bed and stretched out on him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite." And he did. And when she came, he said, "Take your son." She came in and fell at his feet and bowed to the ground. Then she took her son and went out. So Elisha gets to the room. By the way, if you're only looking at a scene, this is not a good scene. Elisha gets there and the boy's dead. The promise, the prophecy that he had made, the promise of the Shunammite woman, he's dead. He's laying on the bed, and he's been dead for some time. The trip between where the woman lived in Shunem and going to Mount Carmel was like 6 or 7 hours. This was not just going around the block. This was a long trip, and so he's been dead for some time by the time she went and got him and they returned. And so she's been dead. And so Elisha, he shuts the door of the room. It's just he and the boy and God as he's praying, and it says he lays out on the boy, and you see this phrasing of mouth to mouth, hands to hands, eyes to eyes, kind of a weird structure, and you get this picture in your mind of how is an adult man going to be laying on top of a 6-year-old. I have a 9-year-old and a 3-year-old, and so I kind of put in between the two of them, and I think of myself laying on either one of them. I would squish them, first off. Second off, it wouldn't match up. The eyes and the proportions are just all off. And really what this is a sequence of praying. It's basically praying that the mouth would come alive and speak again. It's praying that the eyes would be able to see again. It's praying that the hands would be able to touch and feel again. And as he's going through these things, he's getting close to each one of these, and he's touching these things, praying over this boy. And so he goes through this sequence. By the way, Elisha is not the only one who does it. Elijah did it in 1 Kings, the same sequence, and Paul does the same sequence in the New Testament. And so God uses this sequence of praying over people in 3 different occasions. But Elisha here, he prays over the boy, and at first the boy doesn't come back to life, but something's happening. Something's happening. Did you guys hear what was happening? the first thing, he starts to get warm, right? Starts to warm. Well, that's a good sign. I can tell you, and this might sound kind of, sometimes I'm a little bit off. Don't tell Bruce. He knows that already. When he called and asked me, I said, "You're going to let me speak? I'll try not to mess up your church in one Sunday." But I just did a funeral for one of the elders in our church. The elder's mother passed away, and I just did her funeral. I was at the nursing home hospice care unit when she was passing, and even before she passed, her body temperature started to go down. She started to get cold. And when you see these things happen, it's a bad sign. Things were not going to be long. And she knew the Lord, so praise God, she's with Jesus. But for this boy, he had gotten cold. It had been several hours, so the first time he's prayed over, he starts to get warm again. Well, that's a great sign. There's something going on inside, but he didn't come back to life just yet. So Elisha, he gets up and he starts pacing. He starts walking around going, "Oh, God, we're praying here. What should I do next? What's going on?" And God tells him to go through the sequence again. So he gets on the boy again, and he prays eyes to eyes, mouth to mouth, hands to hands, goes through the same sequence of praying again. But this time, there's a different reaction. The boy sneezes 7 times. The boy sneezes 7 times. I did some studying about a year and a half ago, and I found out that when you pass away, there are blockages that start to form within your bloodstream. And these blockages, a lot of times it's blood clots and things like that, but these blockages start to form in different places, very important places like around your organs or your brain. And when that happens, it cuts off the blood supply. And once again, it's another part of the passing away process. What they said in this article that I was reading about a year and a half ago, one of the absolute best ways, the best, in fact, medical science has not been able to come up with as good of a way to get rid of these blockages, to break up these blockages, as a sneeze. A sneeze is an involuntary convulsion of the body. The force of the sneeze moving on the body caused this boy, he sneezed 7 times. If he had any of those blockages, it would have broken those blockages up. He sneezes 7 times, and his eyes open, and he's alive. What an amazing scene. So Elisha gets Gehazi to call the woman, and she comes in, and he gives her son back. Wow, what an awesome scene. This is so cool. It's neat to see how God provides. And see, she got her dream. She got her heart's desire because she was willing to serve. When her heart's desire ends up passing away, because you know what? Good happens, bad happens to everybody, to good people and bad people. The rain falls on the just and the unjust, the Bible tells us. So when bad happens to her, her son dies, she's given another chance. She's given another blessing, and her son is given back to her. What a scene. What a scene. You know, we all have scenes in our story too. If you just look at one scene, you don't get the whole picture. I remember when my oldest son, David is 9 years old now, ornery and cantankerous as ever. Being a preacher's kid myself, I could say he's kind of one of those typical preacher's kids, in trouble most of the time. I love both my boys. But when he was born 10 weeks early. I was on a trial sermon at a friend's church in Canada. So I was out of the country with my wife. 10 weeks before he was due, he was born. He ended up having lung surgery, had a lot of things. That scene was not one of the better scenes in my life, let me tell you. It was a struggle. It was hard. And I'm going, God, what are you doing? I'm trying to serve you. I'm trying to go where you want me to go. God, my son doesn't look like he's going to make it. Now, God God's amazing. God is faithful. And 11 weeks later, my son came out of the hospital, and he's been home, and he was a little behind in some of his gross motor skills. He's caught up on all of that. Man, it's amazing. The scene going into the hospital and him being born early, that was not a good scene. The scene coming out of the hospital and seeing where he's at now is a whole different scene. And I think God's got a plan for his life. David, in the hospital in Canada where he was born, they kept saying, well, he's already facing his first Goliath. And he has been all about facing Goliaths. And there's a scene there that God has a plan. Now, between our oldest and our youngest, my wife and I have lost 4 children. And when that was happening, there's a scene there that you're just heartbroken. You go, God, this doesn't make any sense. Why in the world do you allow this to happen? You don't care about me. When the difficult times come and it doesn't make sense, it's easy to say, my whole life is just horrible. God, you've never helped me. But that's not true. It's one scene. And even though there are circumstances we wish we could change at times, it's only one scene. The whole story is what it is, and God has been amazingly faithful. Our 9-year-old and then our 3-year-old who was born after losing the 4, and he's a blessing. And yes, I'm way too old to have a 3-year-old. I know that. I go to PTA meetings and they think I'm one of the grandparents. I get the deal, but it's so neat how God takes scenes that are looking like they're horrible and they make no sense. And I'm not saying God causes those, but God takes those bad, horrible, difficult scenes and he makes them into something amazing and special. So for the Shunammite woman, she had this horrible scene, and yet from this horrible scene comes a blessing. Now I got one more part of the story. One more part of the story, and it is found in 2 Kings chapter 8. I could finish the story here, and it's pretty cool because the boy that had died comes back to life. That's a great story. But we get to 2 Kings chapter 8, and we see the last time that the Shunammite woman is mentioned in Scripture. So we're going to look at the first 6 verses, but let's hit the first couple. Now Elisha had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, he said, Go away with your family and stay for a while wherever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years. The woman proceeded to do as the man of God said, and she and her family went away and stayed in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. Now, sometimes, before we go further, sometimes difficulties that come into our lives are not necessarily our fault. Did Elisha say, you need to go away because you've been screwing up? No. God is bringing punishment on Israel, and the land is going to have a famine. You need to go someplace where you can not be in the famine. So she heads to the land of the Philistines. Now, the plain of Palestine, which is the land of the Philistines, was much better situated to handle a drought. This famine that was going to come was going to be because of the lack of water. Now, the land of Palestine, this plain of Palestine where the Philistines lived, it was better situated because it had more water supply to it. It was more directly connected to Egypt so they could get supplies in, and they had a large waterway, and so they could get supplies from multiple nations. They had more water of their own, so they were going to be able to handle the drought better than where Israel was. And so she decides to go to the land of the Philistines. The other thing that I noticed right away is there's no mention at all of this woman's husband. Very likely he was elderly before. Very likely by this point he's passed away. So he's not in this story. But so we see this woman takes her family and they go to another nation to live for 7 years during the drought. Now in verse 3 we pick up. At the end of 7 years, she came back from the land of the Philistines and went to appear to the king for her house. Went to appeal, to the king for her house and land. The king was talking to Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, and had said, "Tell me about all of the great things that Elisha has done." So, let me paint this picture for you, all right? This to me is the best part of the story. I've read the other part of the story, and I didn't realize that this part 4 chapters later is also part. You got to catch this. This is so cool. All right? So Elisha has had this relationship with the king. The king is having a discussion with Gehazi, Elisha's servant, in the palace. And they're I picture 2 good old boys sitting sharing war stories, except for they're sharing miracle stories. You ever see 2 pastors get together? Oh man, if you knew what that one parishioner, actually no, we'd never do that. Actually, what it normally is you know what? We had somebody that went and shared Jesus with somebody. Man, about 3 months ago, a lady in the Van Wert Trinity Friends, a lady was so excited about God. She went through the drive-thru at Burger King and realized that the lady that was in the drive-thru was upset about something. She was just getting a drink. They never gave her a straw, so she went through a second time. And at the speaker said, "Hey, I need a straw. Could you get me a straw? And by the way, can I pray for you at the window when I get up there? It sounds like you were upset about something." Gets up to the window and leads her to Christ. How cool is that? See, that's the kind of story. That's a true story, by the way. Happened about 3 months ago at a Burger King while she was driving. She wasn't even in town. That was one of the ladies at Trinity Friends. She just led someone, because that's what you do when you're driving down the road. You go to Burger King and lead someone to Christ. I mean, how cool is that? And so these 2 guys are saying, "Well, tell me about the miracles of Elisha." And the king said, "Well, yeah, let me tell you about some of the stuff that's been happening to me." But the king wants to hear about these miracles. So they're talking. The woman, she's left. She's been gone for 7 years, and she comes back, and she wants to get her land back. There's a problem with that. When you evacuate your land for 7 years, one of 2 things happens to it at this time. It either goes to your closest relative, and they control your land for you, your house for you while you're gone, or it is taken by the king. The king would have taken that in as his own. It would become part of his land. So the king here has taken this land. She did not have any other relatives that were there to take the land, and so her land and her house, all of her fields, everything that they had was absorbed by the king. It was his stuff. So she's coming back to ask the king for her land and her house back. Here's the problem. She has no right to it. She doesn't deserve it. It might have been hers 7 years ago, but she gave that up when they all left. She has no right. She has no claim. All she can do is ask for charity. So she's going to the king saying, "Could you find it in the goodness of your heart to give us our home back, to give us our land back, so we can be a productive part of the community here again?" And so as she's going into the palace, Gehazi happens to be there. Let me continue. This is so cool. So we pick up at verse 5. Just as Gehazi was telling the king how Elisha had restored the dead to life, the woman whose son Elisha had brought back came to appeal to the king for her house and her land. Gehazi said, "This is the woman, my lord, my king, and this is the boy that was brought back to life." They come walking into the palace right as he is telling the story. And the king asked the woman about it, and she told him. So Gehazi tells the story, right? What was the story? So king, that we live in Mount Carmel, and we're traveling back and forth quite a bit. And as we would come through, this lady, she invited us over for lamb kebabs, and then she built a room on the house, and the room had some nice stuff in it. And then she said she wanted a son. We prayed, and she had a son, and then her son died. Elisha prayed over the son. The son came back to life. And as he's sharing the story, he looks up and he's like, "Oh my gosh. King, you're not going to believe this. It has to be, though. I would recognize her anyway. You are not going to believe this. She just came walking in the back door. And that's her son with her. So she comes up and she tells the story. The king says, tell me the story again. She tells the story. Isn't it amazing how God works things full circle? She had a desire in her heart to serve the man of God. She gets the desire of her heart to have a son. The son dies. The son dies. That's a horrible picture. That's a horrible scene. But because the son died and the son was brought back to life, there's something that Gehazi just so happened to be talking about with the king when she walks in. See, it's all part of a larger story that God has been working. Each one of these scenes is working the story into a better account. In farming, the community I live in is all farming. It's flat in farming. In farming, if you want to get a harvest, there's some things you got to do first. You have to prepare the field. You have to plant the seed. You have to fertilize the seed. And that's way oversimplifying it, but those are three of the main things you have to do. And this lady, if she wanted to have a harvest, there were things that she had to do. She served the man of God. She built him a room. That would have cost money, a lot of money. She was willing to give of herself, of her time, of their resources to serve God. And yet, through doing those things, later on in life, there was a harvest that only God could provide. Can I read the last part of verse 6? This will be my last verse for today. So the king says, tell the story. He hears the story. And then he, that's the king, assigned an official to her case and said to him, give back everything that belonged to her, including all of her income from the land from the day that they left until now. How about that? So not only did she get the land back, not only does she get the house back, the king gives an extra blessing. And the extra blessing is 7 years worth of anything that would have came off of those fields, off of those vineyards, the crops, the money. Well, you know what? If you leave for 7 years and you come back and you want to start up a farm again, I live out in the country around a lot of farms. You don't just say, okay, we're going to have a farm. You got to buy a lot of stuff. You got to buy seed, and you got to buy stuff to plant with and stuff to work the fields. And I mean, there would have been costs that would have been needed. And here God has provided everything that she needs to come back, even the money from the 7 years that she was gone. It's amazing how God provides. Each one of us has a story. Where you are right now is not your whole story. It's one of the scenes in your story. God calls us to plow for the kingdom of God. And plowing to provide for the harvest of the future can be hard, it can be costly, it can be time consuming, it can be labor. But God has a plan in place for you to have an amazing harvest. And usually it's a plan that you can't see. Now, maybe you guys are different. Do you guys know everything that's going to happen for the rest of your life? Is it all laid out in front of you? God's never done that for me. You know, if you would have talked to this Shunammite woman and told her all of this stuff was going to happen in this story, she would have been like, you guys are crazy. All of this up and down, it's like a roller coaster. You see, God has a plan for our life, and the whole plan fits together. The scene that we're in right now is just a part of it. But when the things happen, the good things happen, so often we forget that we need need God. When the bad things happen, we get mad at God because the bad things happen. We need to continue to focus on what God is calling us to do. Maybe He has somebody for you to provide a meal for. Maybe He's wanting you to build a room on the roof. Figuratively. Maybe actually, I don't know. I don't know what your houses look like. But God is calling us to do work for His kingdom, to plow in the field. Regardless of what the scene looks like right now, we need to continue to plow, because as we continue to plow and work the field, we're going to see the harvest that only God can bring, just like the Shunammite woman who got the harvest that only God could bring. What kind of plowing is God asking you to do? Are you looking for ways to serve God in God's kingdom? Remember, the plowing that we do today is what produces the harvest we'll see tomorrow. So I love the story of the Shunammite, because to be honest, I went to seminary and all that good stuff. And that's a story that I didn't know until a few years ago, and I started really digging into it. It's amazing to see how God is faithful. The challenge is for us to be faithful to plow the ground. Can I ask a couple questions here? Did the woman, the Shunammite woman, did she really do anything that was supernatural, that was extraordinary? I mean, she cooked some food. If you tasted my cooking, you might say hers is supernatural, mine's really bad. Okay, but I mean, she cooked. She built a room that cost some money. The things that she did, it wasn't that she was, wow, that's amazing. What she did is she was faithful with what she could do, and she did what she could do, and God provided the harvest, and He does the same with us. He calls us to be faithful. It doesn't mean you have to go out and run up and down the road and see every single person in a 27-mile radius get saved because you've been preaching to them for the last 16 weeks straight without sleeping or eating, because you collapse if you do that. What it is you be faithful to do the things that God has for you to do. What is the plowing? What is the field preparation that God is calling you to do? And as we do that, we're going to see God provide an amazing harvest, as He has been and as He does. So that is my message for today. Can I close this with a word of prayer? Let's do that. Heavenly Father, I thank You so much for showing us in Scripture again that when we do the little bit that You've called us to do, that You're so faithful. When I see how You provided for this Shunammite woman, her name is never even given, but yet You cared enough to provide her deepest desire, to bring that boy back to life, and even to give her land and her home back, plus some seed money to continue on with the next harvest. God, it's amazing to see how You provide to Your faithful servants. I pray that You would help us to be faithful to do the work You've laid out for us. Help us to remember that even in the difficult times, even when things seem to be all messed up and not like they're supposed to be, the scene that we are in is not the whole story. The story that You have for us is amazing. You want to bless us and work in us and use us. Help us to continue to faithfully plow, to faithfully serve, to faithfully do what You've asked, so that we can see the harvest that only You can bring. Thank You so much for being with us this morning. Thank You for loving us. Provide Your blessing on each and every one of these folks that have came out today, and help them to continue to plow the field. It's in Jesus' name I pray.